Good morning, everyone. My name is Foster Kinckney. I'm a third-year PhD student in religious ethics here at the University of Chicago Divinity School. I will be introducing our moderator for the day of the conference, Dr. William Schweiker, our first presenter, Dr. Hsiao-Lan, and respondent, Dr. Paul Patton. Dr. William Schweiker is the Edward L. Ryerson Distinguished Service Professor of Theological Ethics and Director of Graduate Studies in the Divinity School. He's the author of numerous books and articles, including Power, Value, and Conviction, Theological Ethics in the Postmodern Age, and Dust That Breathes, Christian Faith and New Humanisms. Dr. Schweiker is the chief editor and contributor of the forthcoming Encyclopedia of Religious Ethics, and he is author of a forthcoming book titled Religious Ethics, Meaning of Ethics. Dr. Schweiker was recently director of the Enhancing Life Project and was awarded the University of Chicago Award for Excellence in Graduate Teaching in 2012. Dr. Hsiao-Lan is a professor at the University of Detroit Mercy, specializing in Asian religions, Buddhism, gender and cultural studies, and comparative religious and social ethics. And of course, that Dr. Hu teaches of particular relevance for the theme of this conference is religions and global well-being. Dr. Hu has published over a dozen articles, and in 2011 published This Worldly Nibbana, a Buddhist feminist social ethic for peacemaking in the global community through the State University of New York Press. Dr. Sid Brown called The Worldly Nibbana an elegant contribution to Buddhist theology, as well as to feminist peace studies, social ethics, and engaged Buddhism. Responding to Dr. Hu's presentation is Dr. Paul Cobb. Dr. Cobb is an associate professor in Chinese religion and thought, East Asian languages and civilizations, and the college. Dr. Cobb's teaching in the college features issues of religious and environmental ethics at its core. His latest work is The Body Incantatory, Spells and a Ritual Imagination in Medieval Chinese Buddhism. Please join me in applause for Dr. Schweiker, our first panel.
Good morning. I feel rather apprehensive in the first session, partly because I'm not quite awake. The world peace begins with your morning coffee. Also because I saved my paper in a flash drive, and in my infinite stupidity, I forgot my flash drive at home. So if I hadn't emailed my paper to Miriam, I wouldn't have a paper to present. This is just a quote that will come back to at the end of the paper. So my paper is on engaged Buddhism. And engaged Buddhism is a contemporary form of Buddhism that engages actively and non-violently with the social, economic, political, and ecological problems of society. It is also, by definition, an effort to express the ideals of Buddhism, including loving kindness and universal goodwill for all in practical action. The foundation of Buddhist ethics is the basic 5 precepts, which have been expounded by numerous leaders and scholars of engaged Buddhism, such as Ken Nang, Sula Shiva-Raksha, Sally King. These engaged Buddhist ethical principles are well in accord with the spirit toward global ethic. Peter Nosko notes that what is perhaps most striking about Buddhist core truth claims is that they are in most ways compatible with the precepts and creeds of other major religions. In my own work, I drew from the most basic Buddhist teachings to lay out the theoretical framework for the construction of a non-sectarian Buddhist social ethic that considers both the local context and the global implications. So rather than repeating myself, or belaboring other Buddhist scholar activist points. In this paper, what I intend to do is focus on the practical side and look at the execution, so to speak, of Buddhist ethical principles. As the global ethic is intended as a statement of what all religions already have in common, rather than an imposition of a global ideology. But my approach here is not to start with a directive and see how Buddhists implement them. My approach is to examine what engaged Buddhists are already doing and see how they're consonant with global ethic. That is, I'm interested in the ethical principles that engaged Buddhists are already expressing, embracing, and/or carrying out in their real-life cross-cultural encounters. Sally King knows that egalitarianism is a very important component in engaged Buddhist movements. And so specifically, I'm interested in the ways in which this egalitarian ideal among engaged Buddhists affirms the global ethic, particularly commitment to a culture of equal rights and partnership between men and women, but actually also the first directive, commitment to a culture of nonviolence and respect for life. And my subject of study is international organizations. International conferences where practitioners of engaged Buddhism from around the globe meet with each other for an extended period of time are perhaps the optimal occasions to see which part of Buddhist ethics are truly the cornerstone of Buddhist global ethics, or have the potential to become global ethics, and also to see in which ways Buddhists might have fallen short of their ideals. Buddhist organizations with members from many different countries also provide a fertile ground for such observations. Specifically, I will be primarily drawing from my substantial involvement with the international conferences of Sakatita, which is the International Association of Buddhist Women, and as well as my previous research on the Dharma Drum Mountain, which is a humanistic Buddhist organization that has centers in 15 countries. I will also reference my limited personal experience with the Conference of International Network of Engaged Buddhists, INEB. What I will show, as I said, is how the ethical principles emerge out of these international organizations, affirms or are in accord with global ethic, even though they may fall short of their ideals from time to time. And this slide is just about my involvements in previous studies with these organizations. And obviously, I'm not going to go through them. I just feel it's necessary to show that I have done substantial studies on them, because a few years back, I heard a talk on Sakatita, and throughout the talk, I found the speaker's characterizations of Sakatita to be off, to put it politely. And eventually I asked her, and she said she has never been to Sakatita. And I feel if you want to study what works and what doesn't, what's upheld and what's not upheld, you have to be there. So, jump to, I have a really, really long paper. Jump to INEB. So the first objective listed on the INEB website explicitly states that they are to promote cooperation and networking among inter-Buddhist and inter-religious social action groups. Likewise, the first objective listed on the Sakatita website is to establish an intercultural alliance of Buddhist women, and another one of the objectives is to promote dialogue among the Buddhist traditions and other religions. So networking is an important value in the operation, and is an important value in Dharma Drum Mountain as well. The founder Shen said, in the 21st century, our world should be based on openness and diversity. It should be an environment in which all parts interact, one in which people respect one another and learn from one another. As a matter of fact, I would say the first cornerstone of global ethics as practice among engaged Buddhists that I've observed in international organizations is networking. And you may think, well, networking is not exactly an ethical principle, but for engaged Buddhists, it is. Because, or at least it is an ethical response to the teaching of interdependent co-arising. And that's interdependent co-arising, Pratisha Sampada. According to Joanna Macy, interdependent co-arising serves not only as an explanation of human existence, but also the ground for Buddhist morality and the means for liberation. Because of co-arising, a person is conditioned by his or her surroundings and experiences, and so each of us is different, since each of us co-arises with different experiences. At the same time, because of co-arising, our physical, verbal, and mental actions condition each other's, positively or negatively. That is to say, because of co-arising, suffering travels in the interconnected web of life, and happiness and liberation travel as well. Macy points out that liberation in the early Buddhist text was not presented as an escape from co-arising, but was reached by employing co-session, by using the leverage of conditionality. Living with multiplicities of contexts and currents can be a source of power. The more interconnections there are, the sooner and wider the change travels. Therefore, for engaged Buddhists whose primary goal is to alleviate suffering, working for the well-being of all, networking will be the ethical response. And judging from the programs and the ways in which participants interact with each other at INET and Samadhita, I would say that participants take networking very, very seriously. And it's a kind of networking that goes way beyond exchanging business cards. At the INET conference, every afternoon there was a time for regional or national or thematic discussions in which participants share experience in their respective activist projects, and they also exchange ideas and plan for future collaborations. At the Samadhita conferences, every afternoon people use workshops to share strategies and techniques for consciousness raising and empowerment. As for Dharma Drum, Shen Yan encouraged his followers to get in contact with others with the ideas and spirit of the Dharma Drum Mountain, saying that it would be more effective in transforming society than he giving talks. Another reason for networking is to learn from others. Shen Yan instructed his followers to take in the strengths of all schools and all sects, including Theravada, Tibetan, and 8 major schools of Chinese traditions, and syncretize them and to do some self-correction. Based on this understanding of influencing and learning through networking, Shen Yan seems to depart from traditional monastic lay distinction, considering it important to cultivate Dharma teachers among lay followers in addition to the monastics. According to one of her really senior disciples, who studied with Shen Yan for over 30 years, and was appointed by Shen Yan when she was a laywoman as a teacher to teach on his behalf. One central component of Shen Yan's vision for humanistic Buddhism is his inclusion of all 4 assemblies of monks, nuns, and laymen and laywomen. In addition, long before Shen Yan appointed 12 what he called task-based Dharma heirs, who are monastic who take positions in the Dharma Drum Mountain system, Shen Yan recognized 7 Dharma heirs, and 5 of them are laypersons. recognizing Dharma heirs from among lay followers is something rather unusual in Chinese Buddhist tradition, and because traditionally the Dharma transmission is passed down as a patrilineal inheritance. And Shen Yan actually criticized this practice, saying that this is privatizing the Dharma because what's transmitted is a patriarch's Dharma rather than the Buddha's Dharma. And the Buddha's Dharma should be benefiting all sentient beings, not just your lineage and your sect. So insofar as the purpose of transmitting the Buddha's Dharma is to benefit all sentient beings, Shen recognized that lay people should be equally as effective as, if not more effective than, monastic disciples. And that is definitely true because in societies where veneration for monastics, like in the US, that is not a given. And actually lots of people look at the shaved heads with suspicion. Lay people can probably have wider influences. They can probably network better, exchange and share information, and garner more support. Even if you're considering a society where 90% of the population identifies as Buddhist, like in Thailand, monastics still constitute a tiny minority. The overwhelming majority in Buddhist cultures is actually Buddhist laywomen. For example, in all three of the international humanistic Buddhist organizations based in Taiwan, women outnumber men by 4 to 1. And that's across the board in all organizations. In other words, lay women can network way better and create more channels of collaboration. And if the goal is to transform society so as to alleviate suffering and increase well-being of all, the talents and networking capability of lay women must be valued and kept. And lay women must be empowered to be the change, in addition to the monastic males who are traditionally given an authority to teach. The ground for genuine networking is intercultural, intertraditional, and interpersonal respect, manifested as valuing each other no matter what the person's gender, age, ethnicity, or religious cultural background is. This egalitarianism is decidedly very consonant with and going beyond the directives of toward global ethics. Johann Geltown, one of the founding figures of peace studies, points out that long-term peace depends on entropy, by which he means high complexity of a system, many and diverse components, and many and diverse ties of interaction between them. Appreciation for the existence of differences is the key to peaceful flourishing of a human society of any size. On the part of Buddhism, the text of early Buddhism recognizes the necessity of learning from different others as well. Association was in Buddhism called good friends is said to be the entire holy life. And in Buddhist definition, good friends are virtuous and wise people who inspire and support you to be ethical, to acquire wisdom. And in Buddhism, wisdom means seeing the intricate web of causes and conditions so that the most beneficial and peaceful course of actions may be chosen. And that means good friends either have to see more lines of causation or have to see lines of causation that you don't see, so that they prompt you to see beyond your own limitation and visions. So that is a difference and the appreciation for and interaction among different elements are good for the spiritual growth of each person in the organization and for the sustained development of the organization as a whole. So all three international organizations of engaged Buddhists that study value diversity on the level of cultures, tradition, and traditions and ethnicities. In practice, and most certainly in theory, on the interpersonal level, that's a little tricky. On the one hand, the Buddhist worldview implies egalitarianism. Whether you say that egalitarianism is grounded in the practice of cultivating loving kindness toward all, or in the idea of Buddha nature, that means the universal human potential for spiritual advancement. Engaged Buddhists affirm the preciousness of each human life and share the ideal that all persons should be respected and treated as equals. In theory, that means engaged Buddhists affirm equal partnership, not only between men and women, but also between young and old, monastic and lay, Eastern, Western, high social class, and low social class, and even humans and non-humans. In practice, participants at these three international organizations very often they do try to carry out the principle of egalitarianism, but to various degrees of success. Very often, hierarchical habits kind of creep back into their practice as people automatically yield to those who are male and or monastic and or older and or more educated and or Western and English speaking. Though this last one may be reversed, this hierarchy may be reversed on occasion. Particularly stubborn among the hierarchical habits that I talk about is patriarchal attitudes. At the INAP conference that I attended, when the small group discussions was thematic, people were really very respectful of each other and giving each other space to talk and share, regardless of culture, ethnicity, educational level, age, or gender. However, when the small group discussion was regional or national, the local hierarchical habit basically took over. One of the small group discussion I went to was an East Asian group consisting of Koreans, Japanese, and Taiwanese. Right away, it was obvious that all the talk was done by older men. With the exception of a couple of young American university students who happened to be there. And at one point, a Taiwanese older man and a Korean older man together were even assigning a task to me, whom they just met. And knowing very well that that's really what's expected, a young Japanese woman leaned over to me and said, "You could say no if you are older, you know." And in Sagadita, given that Sagadita's explicitly stated objectives is to empower women, and given that participants are overwhelmingly female, well, men are welcome in Sagadita as well. But you see traditional gender hierarchy is much less recognizable, much less seen at Sagadita conferences. In general, I have to say I've never been in any other conference where people are so encouraging and supportive of each other. However, the cultural habits of women yielding to men and on the flip side, men talking down to women are still there and discernible. So it's a frequent sight during paper presentation that a Theravada monk would also stand up in the audience and grab the mic and started off with a question but end up mansplaining to everybody. One of the regular male participants of the Sagadita conference often bosses younger women volunteers around, and at one point even referred to himself as the center of power in Sagadita. And at one of the conferences I attended, a white man from the US who was attending Sagadita for the first time was pontificating nonstop to everybody, and then repeatedly called women who don't fit into traditional gender stereotype as weirdos, and talked with much contempt that Sagadita is full of these weirdos. And the most salient example of traditional gender hierarchy in reasserting itself is during the poster design for the 14th Sagadita conference. At that point, the local organizing committee in Indonesia decided to honor 5 internationally known figures on their poster. And the 5 people are Jesuman Tenzin Palmo, who is a British nun, also the president of Egalitarian International, Dr. Damananda, who is a Thai nun, Tuban Children, who is an American nun, Ajahn Brahm, who is a British monk, and Ajahn Sujato, who is an Australian monk. The local organizing committee's first try at a poster was to put the 2 monks' very large photos at the top of the poster and the 3 nuns' smaller photos at the bottom. Gender hierarchy is not the only hierarchy that is habitually upheld at this international gathering of engaged Buddhists. The poster design incidents above revealed 2 other hierarchies. All 5 figures that the organizing committee decided to honor are monastics. They are all monks and nuns. And 4 of them are white Westerners. It's obvious when there are way more Asian monastics than Western monastics. There are way more lay people than monastics. But that's just how the hierarchy goes. Monastics are very often given more authority and higher status, not just by Asian Buddhists, but by some Western Buddhists as well. In my 2 times as the chair of the program committee for Sagadita conferences, it happened quite frequently that the call of paper ended and the program committee, review committee already decided on which papers to accept and which not to accept. Then after that, you receive emails from laywomen from various countries who argue that this paper should be accepted, or this new proposal, it's not even a paper yet, this proposal should be considered only because the author is a high-ranking nun in their country. And being Western or native speakers of English and or more educated affords one a higher regard as well. At the regional group I talked about, the only other persons who got to speak besides the older Asian men were the college-educated young Americans. At Sagadita conferences, I personally witnessed a European laywoman ridiculing a Taiwanese laywoman behind her back, and an American laywoman rolling her eyes at a German laywoman right to her face. Both because the latter's English is not quite as fluent. And so there's that hierarchy there. And I've heard lots of stories about how in the past, people from European and North American countries would look down and talk down to poor women from Southeast Asian countries. As for Dharma Drum Mountain, despite Shenyan's criticism of the traditional usage of Dharma air for privatizing the Dharma, despite his cultivation of a few lay teachers, the identities of the Dharma heirs he appointed and the very use of the phrase Dharma heir signaled to his followers that they should conform to the traditional hierarchy based on monastic status, gender, seniority, and ethnicity. So as I said, around 80% of DDM monastics is female, and yet 8 out of the 12 monastic caste-based Dharma heirs are male, and all 7 Dharma heirs that he recognized before that point were male. And in total 18 Dharma heirs, 13 are monastic, and all monastic Dharma heirs are ethnic Chinese and senior members of the monastic order. None of the ethnic Chinese Dharma heir is lay, and none of the lay Dharma heirs is female. Yeah. Salikin makes the assertion that engaged Buddhism has made an important contribution to global peace activism by highlighting the role played by the mind in constructing conflict and emphasizing the importance of each person working on his or her own mental and emotional state as an element of peace work. In doing so, she continued, they draw upon the traditional strengths of Buddhism, Buddhists have a highly sophisticated 2.5 millennium-old tradition of understanding and transforming the inner workings of the human being. So meditation is a key practice here for working on one's own mental and emotional states. All three international organizations of engaged Buddhists integrate meditation into their operation. Dharma Drum itself is a tradition of Chan, which holds meditation as their central practice. And both Sakadita and INEP begin every day of their conference with meditation. And part of the meditation sessions at both conferences are dedicated to the generation of loving kindness for all sentient beings, regardless of their identity markers. Knowing the need to network with and learn from each other as equals does not immediately translate to treating each other as equals. There's a gap between the knowing and the doing. Often one does not even notice one's actions are being dictated by the hierarchies or by one's egocentric tendencies. And even if one does notice, one is not necessarily able to extract oneself from the hierarchical habit. Because for countless moments in the past, people have been conditioned by the social conventions to act in a certain way, and as such, they have become habitual. And that is why when engaged Buddhists talk amongst themselves about ethics, usually they pay at least as much attention to habits as to karma, and non-Buddhists usually assume karma is the crux of Buddhist ethics. But the Buddhists are really worried about the reassertion of habits. Loving kindness meditation may generate goodwill for all, and basic resting of mind meditation may enable one to be aware where one is under the sway of problematic conditionings and tendencies. But what has been habituated can only be undone after sustained practice against the brain for a very long time, even in a social cultural environment that supports such radical changes. The problem is in a social cultural environment that normalizes and institutionalizes hierarchies based on gender, age, ethnicity, monastic status, it will be very difficult to move toward egalitarianism. Sakadita and INEP do work hard to create an environment for people to network with each other as equals during conferences. But between conferences, their members are scattered around the globe, each in a country where some kinds of hierarchies are upheld. It's conceivable that the old hierarchical habits are more persistent and more stubborn than the new egalitarian habits the conferences seek to foster. As for Dharma Drum, insofar as its current structure institutionalizes the hierarchical habits, it is significantly harder for egalitarian habits to be cultivated and take hold. The engaged Buddhists of all three international organizations strive to work on their own mental states while networking with each other as equals in order to alleviate suffering for all sentient beings, but to various degrees of success due to the persistence of hierarchical habits. As pointed out, and here is the opening quote, throughout our lives, we are all continually exposed to and impacted by these rules of power based on our social cultural locations. These rules manifest intrapersonally and interpersonally. They are enacted and perpetuated institutionally through policies, practices, and procedures that advantage some and discriminate against others. As the rules of power based on social cultural locations have been explicitly and implicitly upheld on intrapersonal, interpersonal, and institutional levels, it is very difficult to shed their influences despite the best of intentions. Nevertheless, the engaged Buddhist emphasis on social transformation and their perspective of co-rising convey the idea that everyone and everything is is always a work in progress, and so there's no reason to declare it a failed project or indulge in oppositional thinking. Sally notes that Buddhist ethics are non-judgmental, non-adversarial, and developmental, work in progress. And Tina Han, one of the guiding teachers of the global engaged Buddhist movement, famously taught if we want to head north, we can use the North Star to guide us. But it is impossible to arrive at the North Star. Well, our effort is only to proceed in that direction. There's no perfect individual, no perfect organization, no perfect network that completely gets rid of the influences of the rules of power, or what I call hierarchical habits, and perfectly embodies egalitarianism and intercultural, interpersonal learning and respect. But what matters is that everyone in those organizations does strive to move in that direction. People in all three organizations easily fall back to the familiar hierarchies, but by and large, based on my study, Sagadita and INET members are more successful in embodying loving kindness for all and in acting intercultural and cultural and interpersonal respect for each other than the members of Dharma Drum Mountain. For example, the Korean older man who was assigning the task to me actually apologized to me shortly after, saying that he had no right to do that. And so even when the cultural habit temporarily took over, he was able to catch himself and try to be more respectful toward a younger woman like myself. As for Sagadita conferences, you have to realize just how massive those conferences are. The first one I went to had 2,400 members from 45 different countries. And so the unpleasant incidences here, there are really minuscule in scale and in significance. In fact, I have heard many participants describe Sagadita conferences as a love fest with megawatt smiles. By comparison, at DDM events and venues, you do very easily see traditional hierarchies, with the exception of a few overseas communities where there's a higher level of racial integration. So, and I'm thinking, what makes Sagadita and INET conferences closer to carrying out the egalitarian ideal? What makes the few overseas communities stand out as an exception in the Dharma Drum system is perhaps the robust presence of human diversity. At Sagadita and INET conferences, there are people from a couple dozen different countries, and the diversity present is just absolutely desolate. Being in the presence of so many people who are apparently different can have the effect of unseating one's habitual way of looking at the world. It may be a constant reminder saying that my way is not the only way. It may not even be a right way. So I better put my ego in check and learn what's going on here. Thus, considered networking and human diversity are important values for engaged Buddhists, not just because they allow the spreading of transformative influences, and not just because they allow the enrichment of individuals and communities, but because they can help eat away gender, age, ethnicity, education, monastic status-based hierarchical habits, and thus open the door for more egalitarian modes of interactions. Exposure to human differences is crucial to cultivating a culture of interpersonal respect and equal partnership, as stated in the global ethics. Thank you.
So just to remind you, my name is Paul. I teach here at the university. I'm very grateful for the chance to participate in this meeting. I admit that the World Parliament and the global ethic are both new to me, so apologies in advance if what I say here is just old news to this group. Thinking about it as I prepared these brief remarks, I realized it may be the first time, if I'm honest, that I've had the chance to participate in an academic meeting that might actually mean something, given the state of our world. A world in which there can be no quote-unquote ivory tower apart from the world. That old image, like the idea of a nature apart from human culture, is tattered and spent and more than ready to be placed in the recycling bin. I found Professor Hu's paper quite stimulating, and really all I want to do here is try to just be a kind of a backup singer and sing some harmonies to it, if I might. It clarified issues for me that feel important. And I'll talk about two of them here. The first concerns, to use a Buddhist image, the true nature of Buddhism as a religion or as a family of practices. And the second is about what we might learn from this deep nature of Buddhist practice as we think about improving the nature of our global being in the world together, which is how I understand the aims of the global ethic and thus of our gathering here today. I'll take the insight into the nature of Buddhist practice first. Buddhism is too often, especially here in what we call the West, understood to really be first a philosophy or a set of doctrines about the nature of the impermanence of things. That is, too simply put, that things understood as separate and distinct from other things are evanescent and ever-changing, yet we cling to them anyway, misunderstanding their nature, which causes all kinds of problems for us. The basic Buddhist insight here being that no thing, in fact, exists separately and distinct from any other thing or from all other things, that what actually exists, perhaps, is a web of ever-shifting relationships that we construe in particular ways, depending on our psychological and cultural minds, among other things. On this same view of what Buddhism is most basically, Buddhism is said to be a set of contemplative techniques intended to clarify these insights and to make them real in our own lives. And this is true, to an extent. But thinking that this is really what Buddhism is, as I think Professor Wu shows on a Buddhist reading, simply delusional. Just like my own standard thoughts about myself being separate from all of you out there in the audience. The ideas and practices that I just very much too simply outlined only arise under social conditions, particular cultural and historical social conditions, from which they can, in my view, in no sense be understood to be apart. As in particular waves, philosophy, contemplation, etc., could arise independently and independent of the whole Lake Michigan of history and culture and evolution, etc. Here we get to one of the most important insights into the nature of Buddhist practice, and I would say, at least based on my own understanding of the global ethic offered in Professor Hu's paper. This is the centrality of habit to the formation of worlds, and not merely personal habit, but institutional and cultural habit. Buddhist texts sometimes speak of the ways we are as if smoked through with predilections born of actions over time, which is to say of karma. And as Professor Hu points out, these habits and predilections are at the center of what Buddhists talk about very often when they talk about ethics. So we might say that Buddhism is also essentially about character formation. Again, not just personal character, but cultural and institutional character. As she notes too, this is not only in terms of prescription, but of description. The positive character formation of making people through the inculcation of new habits meant to counter and eventually overcome the old habits. That is what Buddhists sometimes call all of our ancient twisted karma. These new people, the tradition calls good friends, as she says, that is, teachers. Note how the term assumes, good friends, the term assumes relationships. And the paper explores that as well. Just as Buddhism teaches that all is relation, it's only relation really. It tries to make people who not only know this in their bones, but who practice forms of relation informed by an understanding of infinite and intimate relation, all the way down, as they say. However, and here is where the paper is at its strongest on my reading, these projects of character formation are hindered by, and in some cases wholly obscured by, what they are related to, the cultural and institutional conditions in which they arise. In short, human civilization, and in particular the ancient and abiding habits of patriarchy, in Asia, in the West, everywhere. Thus, for example, awakening, or enlightenment, very often arises, nearly always actually, as the figure of the patriarch, the older man, construed by tradition and institution as the locus and the form of that awakening, with correspondingly lower and more peripheral positions for women. Because these two formations, the discourses of awakening and of patriarchy, do not simply coincide in a neutral way, but they in fact buttress each other. The position of the patriarchy is in a sense enchanted, naturalized, and unassailable. And we've seen in American Buddhist institutions, at least, again and again, the terrible damage that these conditions have wrought. As Professor Hu shows on one reading, this is all really just a failure of nerve, in a sense, on the parts of Buddhists. A failure to embrace a thoroughgoing vision of interrelation. Keep in mind that patriarchal habits are just as much the stuff of traditional Buddhism as are the exquisite visions of interdependence and compassion so rightly beloved across the world today, and I think reflected in the global ethic. Yet these habits, as Professor Hu makes so clear, are at their core as a harsh denial of the visions of conditioned arising or interdependent co-arising, of the absolute centerlessness inherent to that vision. For when everything is understood to give rise to everything else in an unknowably vast and intimate way, there is simply no way to assert a center, and any such assertion would count as delusion, according to Buddhism. Yet all too often, in actuality, as we've just heard, men, especially older and institutionally established men, or bearded professors, are indeed asserted to be just that center. Professor Hu has told a number of stories this morning that make clear that the disasters that follow from this contradiction. But more importantly, I think, she also describes how Buddhist women and feminist habits of thought and practice are, at least in places, working profound changes in the tradition and directly addressing these fundamental and dismal contradictions. Indeed, to the extent that personal and institutional habits are at the center, they may be the only thing that is working these changes. Buddhist thought and practice alone, I think it's fair to say, has not done a good job of institution building, at least most of the time. Buddhist insight and meditation practice, it really appears, are simply not enough. The idea that centuries, even millennia of grinding habit, centuries, even millennia of grinding habit can be evaporated, whether in an instant of insight or gradually through meditation, I think she shows, is simply, I'm afraid to say that history backs this up, not true. Buddhism has powerful tools with which to counteract the grinding weight of all these habits of mind and behavior, but they tend to come packaged with the grind itself. Feminist thoughts and habits of behavior appear, as Professor Hu argues, I think, to simply be necessary to the creation of a Buddhism that lives up to its own ideals, and that can claim honestly to be living up to the ideals expressed in the global ethic we're here to grapple with today. In showing this, Professor Hu contributes to, and has for some time, I think, been a signal practitioner herself of, one of the most important trends, not only in the study of Buddhism, but in the practice of Buddhism too. As well as in the attempt to develop a better human civilization. Her paper today is, I think, a beautiful example of the rethinking of Buddhist doctrines in ways that require the inculcation of new habits informed by feminist ethics. Her description of open and non-oppressive horizontal networks as a counter to the hierarchical lineages that lie at the center of so many Buddhist traditions puts this very nicely. They are not only better able to nourish human life in the ways I think you will agree described in the global ethic, they are, she argues, at least implicitly, the best ways to express the insights into the conditioned arising of all phenomena at the heart of Buddhism itself. I think this is worth repeating. Feminist habits of thought and behavior on this view, a view that, as a scholar of the history of Buddhist practice, I really find compelling, appears simply necessary if Buddhists are going to fulfill their nature as Buddhists, as that nature is described in their own scriptures, commentaries, and ethical canons. Also, it seems, in such rarefied levels of Buddhist practice as the solving of what we can think of as the existential riddles known as koans. Ben van Overmeyer, in a recent essay, explains how the habits of Buddhist women when solving koans differ in startling ways from those of men, and may be changing how their practices are understood. Men, following traditional forms, embody what he calls a grasping way, which, quote, tends to be confrontational and full of martial imagery, unquote. Koans are, after all, sites of what is sometimes known by the hypermasculine aim of Dharma combat, where one, at least according to traditional texts, expresses one's mastery and dominance, or at least expresses one's wisdom in the language of mastery and dominance. Women, Van Overmeyer reports, increasingly approach these encounters differently. They follow what he calls a, quote, granting way, stressing connection instead of opposition. Rather than enforcing the traditional top-down hierarchy in a language strikingly similar to Professor Hu's, Van Overmeyer notes that their practices, quote, gesture towards a Zen lineage that is universal, extended to everyone, even to the non-human, unquote. Maybe all this explains why, or maybe just offers the true esoteric explanation why the Buddhist savior, Bodhisattva Avalokiteshvara, embodiment both of compassionate action and patron of the Heart Sutra, perhaps the central expression of Buddhist thought in East Asian Buddhism, became a woman, or a female figure anyway, in the tradition studied by Professor Hu. Anyway, it's something to think about. To conclude, if I might very briefly build on both Professor Hu's paper and the last sentence of Van Overmeyer's study I just quoted, and also the global ethic, or the 2018 version of it, as I just learned, which thanks to this conference I recently discovered. Why stop there? The ethic declares the following, in language I can't help but hear as Buddhist, quote, we are interdependent. Each of us depends on the well-being of the whole, and so we have respect for the community of living beings, for people, animals, and plants, and for the preservation of earth, the air, water, and soil, unquote. Professor Hu's clear insights into the ways that seeing past mere philosophy to the deeper depths of habit, and the people and institutions it forms, and the ways in particular that feminist habits offer a counter to the bad habits of both Asian and Western pasts and presents, indeed hold up very well when we push them further. For there is no good reason, I think, to stop the formation of a nourishing horizontal network at the borders of Buddhism, or indeed of the human. All sentient beings, as Buddhists themselves say, are in this together, and more are this. Each of us completely the whole, and the whole none other than each of us, to quote the Hawaiian Buddhist philosophers of Tong China. Indeed, for my own taste, I found probably the most profound recent discussions of Buddhist ideas of interpenetration and conditioned arising in the writings of the ecological thinker Timothy Morton, perhaps most clearly in his book, The Ecological Thought, and Professor Hu's discussion of both the grinding force of habit and its liberative potential is, again, just following my own predilections here, also extremely well described in the writings of the ecological movement known as the Dark Mountain Project, and their call for an uncivilization against and moving past the civilizations that have led to the world in agony, described so starkly at the opening of the global ethic. Here I also think of Joanna Macy, already mentioned, whose Eco-Buddhist Council of All Beings was my own first experience of Buddhist thought and practice more than 30 years ago. An experience in which I took on the task of trying to imagine myself as and to speak as a patch of moss on a decaying stump. A very powerful way to imagine a horizontal network, I can tell you. The model of open and nurturing horizontality, in Professor Hu's language, one mindful both of habits that block it and those that enable it, offers another such way. And I'm grateful for this chance to try to repeat, I think, and offer some harmonies to that vision as offered by Professor Hu here today. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you to our speaker and our respondent. I have the task of posing the first question, and then we'll have the two of you speak to this, and then we'll open it up with a student who will ask a question, and then we'll have it open to the floor. And we have until what time? We have until 11:05. 11:05. Oh, that's very good. It seems to me that both the elegant paper, 10:55. The elegant paper and response pose a question that I think we'll see run through most of this conference: what different strategies to deal with it? And that is the embeddedness of religious traditions and cultural forms. How one understands that relationship, to what extent. I took part of the force of your argument to be that engaged Buddhism does not seek to escape or transcend those complex habits, cultural habits, which both form and deform Buddhist practice, but rather to try to develop new ways to use those processes, in a sense, against themselves. Am I understanding you correctly? I think that may be a very unique way of thinking about the relation of religion and culture, and we'll need to see how that relates to other traditions. So I would like the both of you to say a bit about your understanding of this trans-religious problem and how religions become embedded in cultures, depend on them, and yet can be stunted or warped. Could you say a little bit more about this? You're using the example of hierarchy, but
I think you already put it very clearly. It's,
we'll fill that out because it's hard to understand for those of us not in that tradition what that means.
What that means, or what that could be, what.
How do you like to?
Off the top of my head, I'm thinking about how at least these three international organizations deal with youth. And this is probably a problem for most religions nowadays, is that every gathering is white-haired people. You rarely see young people in lots of churches, in Buddhist sanghas, practice place. And so there are ways to engage young people, and young people nowadays they have this almost knee-jerk reaction to any imposition of traditional hierarchy. And so that actually, I think that's a good way to look at it, because religion cannot survive without the next generation. You have to have young people. And so how do you cater to young people? You have to set up your own religion in a way that young people wouldn't find repulsive. And that would probably mean to tone down some of your traditional teachings. But usually once you bring them in, then the traditional hierarchies reassert themselves and try to bring them in the fold and say, this is how we do things. You want to be a better Buddhist this way. And so it's a constant struggle between how you want to cater to a wider audience or the next generation, and how do you want to preserve whatever it is you're preserving. So yeah, in that sense, we do see how religions inform relationships and deform relationships.
As a historian of Buddhism, one of the kind of fallacies that I see pretty widespread in my own field is when people will talk about Buddhism or Buddhists of the past as being somehow only Buddhists, right? And not, in my case, Chinese, and I study Chinese, history of Chinese Buddhism mostly, or in the present case, not Americans, right? And it's a very strange idea, isn't it, that we could somehow, maybe when we step into the church or the temple or start thinking or read a Buddhist book or something, that we become only that, right? I don't see how that could possibly be. One kind of quick side, and another, right, at the same time, or part of that, when Buddhists seek to express the insights of Buddhism and to work out their logics, and of course that's what Buddhism is, right? The history of people in a sense working out the logics of Buddhism as they can understand them. That they can only do so in the language, in their own language, right? In the language of their own culture, and not only in the spoken language, the written language, but in the cultural language, right? In the cultural forms, in the institutional forms. And so there's always, maybe, something working against, what you're trying to work for. And this is simply part of the struggle. Just one thing I've been thinking about since, very soon to be Dr. Renaud was quoting, I think, Václav Havel right this morning, saying that the truths that the global ethic was getting at in religions was somehow in their primordial, right, in their primordial state. But in the case of Buddhism, that's certainly not the case. It's not just not true, right? Buddhism at its beginnings is not something that I think matched very well with the global ethic, right? And it's only, it took a few hundred years really for them to start to think, well, what about other people? What about all beings, right? And then many centuries after that, so what about trees? What about non-human nature? And then, a good 1,000+ years after that, to say, well, yeah, what about women, right? And so it's that, it's this history of working out the logics of the tradition and trying to make them true, right? Trying to, have Buddhism live up to its own promises. That's where the truths of Buddhism lie, it seems to me. Just wanted to say that as much as I like Václav Havel.
Great, thank you very much. Let's open it up to questions. And again, we'd like to give preference to a student to begin with. Yes, over here.
Yeah, thank you very much for the very interesting.
Could you stand up so we can hear you?
Yeah, thank you very much for your interesting lectures. And I have a question to both Professor Hu as well as Professor Ka. It seems that the point is that according to your lecture, it seems that you just framed some sort of contrast between the kind of ideal for equality and also some actual kind of conditions of kind of habit of hierarchy within the Buddhist tradition. But my one question would be how far or whether the traditional form of Buddhism is also responsible for a certain element of hierarchical practices in a certain sense, because so given that kind of basically it is kind of first of all within the community of Buddhism, I think the actual values of the tradition that the community is committed to might have attributed some element for the persisting habit of hierarchy in a certain sense. Only one, and even though there has been constant emphasis on non-discrimination and equality within the kind of traditional form of Buddhism, but seems that there also might be some elements of doctrines in Buddhism that might have just intensified the kind of actual histories of habitual kind of hierarchies within the community. So the point of my question is that whether and how far the traditional form of Buddhism might have attributed that kind of formation of karma in the kind of hierarchical thinking.
That's why I focus my talk on engaged Buddhism rather than just any traditional form of Buddhism. Engaged Buddhism is probably at the progressive wing of Buddhism, where they actually openly say they disagree with some of the traditional questions of the doctrine, in your average traditional Buddhism, the hierarchy is basically taken as a given. It's part of a package of Buddhist teaching and Buddhist doctrine, and people don't tend to be critical about what's being taught to them, and they think that's part of the Buddha Dharma. And so there have been quite a few Buddhist temples in society that I've been to. For example, they will, from the beginning, repeat to you how, according to traditional teaching, women have bad karma, and admitting women into a monastic order will cut the life of Buddhism by 500 years. And lots of people really just take that to be true. That's exactly what the Buddha taught, and nobody even questioned that. But so that's why I focus on the engaged Buddhists, and they focus on what can be and what direction Buddhist ethical principles can take, rather than just your average traditional Sangha.
contrast Sakyadhita and Dharmadhara Mountain. And you're going to find some like important points of difference. But these two institutions are of totally quite different species. Like Dharmadhara Mountain is the expression of a lineage, and so Chan lineages go back to the Middle Ages, and it is historically has been a monastic institution. So everything that's part of monasticism for many centuries is like right there in the institution, and it's kind of a major decision or a grappling, a problem. How much are we going to try to change the monastic institution itself right now, as opposed to doing other things that need to be done? Whereas Sakyadhita is something totally new.
Yes.
It's like founded in the 1980s as not the expression of one lineage, but Buddhist women in general, internationally, something like it was never done before. So you can actually really expect that in spite of its defects, Sakyadhita is going to be doing better than a really traditional institution where, like I said, you have to look at the challenge of changing something that's assumed a certain form for many centuries. So just one more thing, going back to the roots of the religions. So I just, the roots of Buddhism are not that easy to get at. But I once asked Rita Gross about the passage where the Buddha says that, all right, women can be ordained, but only with these 6 weighty rules. And then that same passage in Scripture, he clearly states that women can attain enlightenment. But then he makes the 6 weighty rules. I asked Rita Gross, did she believe that that was an interpolation by some people who were fooling with the text, that is to say, male editors a few centuries later, and she indicated she clearly felt that it was. So it was just her view of something to do with the roots.
There are philological evidences that says that part is an later incorporation, possibly 300 to 400 years after the historical Buddha. But then your question kind of hinges well with this, because the reason I focus on engaged Buddhism, but also into Dhammadram, which is a more traditional kind of Buddhism with its own lineages, is because all major international organizations of Taiwan now claim themselves to be humanistic Buddhism, and they emphasize social engagement, emphasize doing as much as you can to alleviate suffering. So that put them more on the progressive side of Buddhism, and because of their international appeal, they also it's the whole how you grapple with the weight of tradition, the cultural forms, and they have to emphasize the spirit of universal respect that's already in Buddhism. And so, yes, it is a lineage, the Chan lineage, and they probably inevitably, I'm not sure, probably inevitably would stick to some of the traditional rules. But at the same time, they have this vision of transforming society for the better. And in that effort, they have to adjust their message to not just people who already listen to them, but to everybody else, and young people and people in the Western country. And I think over time they would try to emphasize more and more the egalitarian ideals or the humanitarianism, and de-emphasize their monastic lineage and hierarchy. The whole issue of the 8 weighty rule thing, that women can be ordained That, for example, nowadays is one of the topics that young women monastics pursuing higher degree will deal with. And I've read so many master's theses and documented dissertations on that very same topic, because really nowadays nobody can accept that, and you have to tell people that no, that is no longer where we stand now. And so even in Donald Trump, they generally have that position that no, we're not going to stand by that tradition.
Well, on the issue, that's just on the simple fact that there are just very different forms of Buddhism, and that monasticism is going to have its own weight, really. It's certainly the case.
In order to keep on schedule, it is now 5 till. We're going to have to break off. Sorry. We'll pick up questions in the next section. We have maybe 10 minutes. Remember that there are restrooms on each floor, the cafe in the basement as well. Okay? We will see you in a few minutes. Thank you. Let's thank our speakers.